around the world understand, have different ways of understanding relationships between humans and animals. I just wanted to do a couple of things. That's firstly to just run you through the what we will be doing today. So the first hour, and rather than give a time, because we're all scattered across all sorts of different time zones. So in the first hour, I'll just give a little bit about Val Plumwood and then about Erika. Erika will give the lecture or address, bearing in mind Erika's throat is a little bit rough, so she may call for questions or comments in between that period. There's a Q&A, you know, just some questions at the end and comments. There'll be a short break. And then then we'll resume on the same Zoom. And the second, most of the second hour will be spent in the workshop. So Val Plumwood. Val Plumwood is a remarkable, or was a remarkable woman, and has left an incredible legacy, especially around environmental and animal politics. A lot of you would know her work. I just wanted to acknowledge that she is an inspiration, and I'm really pleased to be hosting or co-hosting this event that's in her honour. These are some of her works. I thought I'd just quote her when she said, to the extent that we hyper-separate ourselves from nature and reduce it conceptually in order to justify domination, we not only lose the ability to empathise and see the non-human sphere in ethical terms, but also get a false sense of our own character and location that includes an illusory sense of autonomy. The failure to see the non-human domain in the richer terms appropriate to ethics licenses supposedly purely instrumental relationships that distort our perceptions and in framings impoverish our relations and make us insensitive to dependencies and interconnections. Thanks, Val. And so Erika is our on the committee, spent a lot of time thinking about who might be invited to give this lecture, and Erika is a perfect person to give it. Erika focused on relationships between humans and non-human animals, and she's been preoccupied with this across her career. Her research interests include complexity theory, gender and theoretical and political challenges, to exclusive humanism, and her empirical research has looked at farmed animals, companion animals, and service animals. And there's some of the books that she's authored or co-authored. So today's session, we'll start with the lecture where Erika will draw on aspects of her work in animal sociology, which frame human relations with non-human animals in terms of a social system of domination, Anthroparchy. And then we'll come back and we'll, after we've had the lecture, we'll come back and we'll look at the workshop. Any questions or comments before I hand over to Erika? Okay, well, thank you, Erika. I'll just get rid of mine.
Okay, thanks so much for the invite, Heather, and the committee. It's a real honour for me. And if somebody had said to me 30 years ago, you'll be giving a lecture in honour of Val Plumwood, I really wouldn't have believed it. Firstly, I wouldn't have believed that Val Plumwood was destructible. And secondly, I wouldn't believe that animal studies had expanded to the extent that it had, or that I would have been able to make a career out of writing about the environment and animals and gender. So next slide, please, Zoe. I thought I'd better start by thinking about Val and my relationship with Val Plumwood. So I first read Feminism and the Mastery of Nature in 1994. Somebody lent me their copy, and I read the whole thing, which I don't often do with books, and I thought, this is fantastic, I must buy it. And the first copy fell apart because I used it so much, and I have a second copy now. And because I'm an abuser of books, it's absolutely covered with highlights and scribbles and comments, and some of the pages are loose. So I would say that is a text that has affected me greatly and that I've gone back to across my career. Why? I think when I first read Mastery of Nature, it raised a kind of challenge for me. So I identify, well, sometimes I identify as an IR or politics person, but mainly I think I'm probably a sociologist. And I think Val's idea of linked dominations, which she articulates so beautifully in that book from a philosophical position, is absolutely key to how I think about the world. So reading Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, I thought, wow, this is amazing. Somebody actually thinks like I do. And the challenge to me was Val's comment that these linked forms of domination, we might call it intersected now, perhaps, although that's a term I'm a bit ambiguous about, are key, she says, to different forms of social relations. And I thought, well, this is a challenge to people like me who are sociologists to see what that looks like in terms of social theory rather than in terms of philosophy. So what did I pick up from Val? Obviously, the idea of oppressive dualisms and how these are linked, the idea of linking in a network. And there was a whole debate in all kinds of feminism at the time, Black feminism, left feminism, as well as ecological feminism, about whether there was a kind of single system of oppressive relations. Val sometimes says it is a single system, or that it has a common centric structure when she talks about Eurocentrism, androcentrism, anthropocentrism. But she doesn't always. So I think she's kind of has an ambivalence on that matter, which is something that I would say I started with sharing and then went on a slightly different path. One of the things I particularly like about the Mastery of Nature is that there is always an optimism in Val Plumwood's writing. There's always a possibility for thinking about our differences and celebrating them and understanding them in non-hierarchical ways. When it comes to the environmental culture book, interesting there, I think, is her interspecies communication, which is something that I'm really drawn to at the moment and working on and thinking about at the moment. And also central, I think, to that book is querying the idea of the human as an animal, which is something else that I've been interested in. Well, I'm always interested in it, but more so at various points in my work. And philosophical animism, really, the idea that nature has intentionality, that by paying close attention to it, we might understand it better, but we still need to understand that there is a mystery in the other that is not human. And finally, I've always really enjoyed Val's kind of off the cuff, what I would call nature writing and ability to tell a good story, and her engagement with creative ideas in terms of her research and her work. And in reading about her travails, living with a wombat, what I'm going to talk about today is people's travails living with dogs, but Val's humour comes through really strongly. And I think in animal studies, a lot of what we do is troubling, is upsetting, and we so need to hang on to the kind of chinks of light, the bits of optimism, and to our senses of humour. Next slide, please, Zoe. So I made up the term. I often say to my students, theory is really just stuff we make up. But I made up this term on my PhD. I developed it more in Developing Ecofeminist Theory, but where it really links better to animals is in this book, Social Lives with Other Animals. So the idea of anthroparchy, I wanted to develop a sociological framework. So this was my kind of answer to Val's challenge, really, about those interlinked forms of domination. So anthroparchy, for me, it's a social system, a system of social relationships, and a quick summary would be it's human domination, a system of human domination, or a system of social relations which center humans and prioritize their interests. I'm also drawn to complexity theory. So I see anthroparchy as a complex system. So it's something that certainly isn't static. So there's all kinds of ways in which human and non-human natures are implicated and drawn in to relations. Systems don't sit there on their own in complexity analysis. They're always kind of breached. They're always open to other systems. And I thought that's quite an interesting way of thinking about how systems of patriarchy, colonialism, anthroparchy intersect, interact, make each other up, and perhaps there are tensions in between, in the interests of those particular systems of domination too. I talked about different ways in which non-human nature and animals are dominated through structures of violence, politics, culture, production, and of course that's linked to reproduction. But I also wanted to have an idea of a system that kind of changes over time, that changes cross-culturally and changes geographically. And one of the things I've always thought about, I went to a debate in Parliament last week, and people were just saying animals this, animals that, and I felt so frustrated by the end. I said, why? I wanted to say, why don't you just say dogs and cats, because that's actually what you mean, but you're just talking about the animal in this very kind of general sense, because I think different species in different places, times and contexts might be marginalized. They might not feature as central to people's thinking or to policy making. But of course, also we know that animals are exploited economically and that they also might be oppressed, some species in similar ways to which humans are oppressed. Next slide, please, Zoe. So in thinking about this lecture, I ended up rereading my falling apart copy of Feminism and Mastery of Nature. And you might think, well, maybe you've moved away from Val, Erika. Maybe you started with Ecofeminist Theory, and that was a very Val Plumwood influenced text. But I actually think Val Plumwood is still very much there in my work. So this is the latest book, which was published in May, and looks at everyday life, really, everyday social encounters with dogs. And I'm interested in the everyday because I think it really is what human beings are about. It's accessible to research and it tells us a lot, the essence of who we are, says Sarah Pink. And for me, as a sociologist, I just feel after 30 years, I still look at calls for grant applications and think, yes, the sociology of the family in the UK, it's absolutely huge, but where are the animals there? Where are the non-humans? They're still way, way away from the mainstream. Where are they in the sociology of work or in the sociology of care work? Surely even feminists can consider the situation of animals and do that more systematically. The sociology of home is something that's kind of sociologists have adopted from geography, but it's certainly emerging and expanding, but animals don't feature there either. And it's not only humans within the household. And in terms of food and eating, which is where I kind of started really, still there's not enough critical stuff about the creatures that we eat and why we might be eating them and how they are made into food. So why dogs? Well, if you know me or knew me, you would say, well, Erika's just obsessed with dogs. So it was a kind of natural choice for me. But in the UK, it's the most popular companion animal kept in the home, so 34% of homes, and people have a stereotype that the British are terribly keen on dogs. I don't think that's true, and I certainly don't think they treat them particularly well, but certainly figures are higher elsewhere in Europe and certainly in the Americas. So Argentina has the highest population of dogs kept in the home. And certainly in my work and the work of others such as Nikki Charles, there's a lot of intimacy in terms of the sharing of home, which makes dogs interesting. So I thought I was doing multi-species ethnography, but I'll talk about that more in the workshop, because the more I think about it, the less I think that's what I was doing. Sorry about the voice. Next slide, please, Zoe. So domination is always my framework when it comes to human and animal relations. So there are aspects of the book that are kind of uplifting and funny, but the framework is always that we as a species have powers over others. So just to keep a dog as a companion is a very significant power relation. And I started off by going back to the geography, Foutuan, who my colleagues in geography use a lot, and his idea of domination and affection. And he says in that book that if you want to choose a pet par excellence, you would choose the dog, because the extent to which we've modified them physically and behaviourally is incredibly, is more significant compared to animals such as cats, for example. And Tuan always says that domination and affection are not opposites. They're actually part of the same thing when it comes to developing the idea of the pet. Marianne Montemedi Fraser, far more recently, says that this is actually quite a problem. So we have modified dogs, their behaviour and their bodies, but the way in which we think about dogs and the way in which science in particular talks about dogs is that they're kind of hardwired to be with humans. So there's this idea of the bond between humans and dogs. So that's even in the name, Canis Familiaris. Who are they familiar with? Us. And she makes the point, which I think is an incredibly valid one, 70 to 90% of dogs in a country such as the UK are seen to have behavioural problems, and those, she suggests, are probably an objection to their living conditions. And I couldn't resist this Gary Larson cartoon, because I think that just about sums it up. So as Mark Beckhoff and Jessica Pearce say, we've got really unreasonable expectations of dogs. And Haraway, who's somebody I have to read Haraway printed, because I kind of pick her up and throw her down, so to speak. I often get frustrated and then I think, oh no, hang on, that was an interesting idea. But being a pet is a difficult job for a dog, she says, and I do think that is true. Next one, please, Zoe. So how does Anthroparchy relate to our relationships with dogs? Well, certainly dogs are marginalised. They may be excluded from our spaces. Increasingly in the UK, they may be excluded from public spaces. When I travel with my dogs, I find there's a far less of a kind of exclusive public when it comes to taking your dogs where you might like. Certainly, they don't feature very often in policy making, but perhaps the key way in which dogs might be marginalised is in everyday life. So very many dogs are left in a house alone for many hours, and there's a whole question about whether that is a good life for a creature to be living. We know about the exploitation of dogs, puppy breeding industries similar to the industries in which animals are bred for food, that animals are exploited for entertainment, whether that's commercially or actually in home settings, if we think about the guy in the previous slide with the biscuit on the dog's nose. A question that I have looked at is the use of dogs in security, particularly by the military. But I'm also currently thinking about the use of dogs in caring labour as therapy animals, and to what extent that is an appropriate way for dogs to be treated, whether this is work, how this is work, and how those relationships really of affection and domination present themselves. And of course, dogs can be oppressed, whether that's by harsh training regimes, whether that's by neglect, or whether that's simply because they can't socialise with their own kind. So it's very rare that dogs would get to reverse the power relations, as in the cartoon on the right. Next one, please, Zoe. But one of the things, and I think this is an inspiration from various kinds of ecofeminism, not just Val Plumwood's work, but certainly nature is agential, and dogs have agency often in shaping the conditions to some extent of their own lives. So humans can sometimes enable their agency. We may play with dogs, we may enable their socialization, but a lot of the time that may also be initiated by dogs themselves. There are also different kinds of relationships. So some people may treat a dog as a toy or as a dependent or as a surrogate child. But for many, they are companions, and people often talk about dogs as friends, for example. And certainly, when people and dogs walk together, that generates particular kinds of relations that are perhaps sometimes unpredictable and do enable dogs to express themselves. And certainly in walking, in being outside, in being in public with dogs, we see forms of intra-communication between dogs and humans who they don't live with, and between dogs and other dogs. Next one, please, Zoe. The title I wanted for this book was not Animal Entanglements, it was Muddied Living, but Roman and Littlefield were absolutely stubborn about it and wouldn't produce contracts until I changed the title. Because I think dogs muddy our relations in various ways. They literally muddy our homes, but they also muddy the boundaries of species in doing that. One of the things I did in thinking about dogs in our homes was I looked at literature and stuff on the internet about the ideal home, and I can tell you that it's very clean dogs that ever feature in a photograph. And if you want to sell a property that you own, you need to eliminate any sign of dogginess from it in order to secure a successful sale. So certainly animals bring in extra stuff. Thank you. Yes, Muddied Living is definitely better. Dogs bring in extra stuff to the home. This lovely illustration I managed to borrow from Michelle Westerlarken, who had produced it in a journal special issue that I edited it. And it just kind of summed up my life with cats, really. Perhaps you have more control over what the dogs bring into the home, but what the cats bring in, and one brought in a poor bird just the other day, is another thing. People talked about smell a lot. People wondered whether their houses stank. But as this person, I love this quote particularly, the farting dog just creates an atmosphere, a thick fog of horror, and always nearest to me. And sometimes, well, bloody hell, phew, God, a thick, thick fog. She was in stitches. She kept having to stop and laugh. So all the stories I had about ripped cushions, there was a dog that got through 3 sofas. And that was seen as a funny tale to be told. I bet it wasn't particularly funny at the time, considering how much these things cost. But there's always a human accommodation about the mess which dogs might make. Next one, Zoe, please. And certainly there was some, not the majority, but there were some people who did restrict the space that their dog used. But I only found very few participants where this was a real thing. Dogs should not be on the furniture, or dogs mustn't go upstairs in the house. So in this example, you know, the guy says, clearly he's quite a big dog. I don't think I've ever seen a dog that size. And when he says he's not allowed on the sofa, I thought, well, I don't think even a 4-seater would actually accommodate this animal. He's actually so big. So it could be the nature of the house, the nature of the dog. This person also had a house that was pretty full of people as well. Or this person at the bottom, it's a woman having so many dogs at once, I couldn't let them just take over the house. This is somebody who rescued dogs, fostered dogs, sometimes had up to 10 or 12 dogs in her house. And as I interviewed her in her house, it wasn't actually that much space. So there may be particular explanations other than that dogs are not close to one's heart. Next slide, please, Zoe. Now, I've called this dirty pleasure because I found far more people slept with their dogs than I ever anticipated, and they felt some sense of guilt in talking about this. Many people did not intend to sleep with a dog, but there were tales of kind of ingenuity, whether it was barking, whether it was being able to open a door, whether it was being able to get in the bed when people didn't realise the dog was getting in the bed. But there were lots of stories like this. So this person with the king-size bed, he takes up most of it. So I find him wedged across the top or in a really small bit of the bed, and he's stretched out over the whole thing. And again, this was seen as a kind of humorous thing rather than an actually problematic thing. One of the interesting things I found, because a lot of the interactions in the home are definitely gendered, that women were more likely to allow dogs in the bed than men, and those living in heterosexual relationships would often say, oh, when my partner's away, the dog sleeps in the bed, or the dog likes my partner being away because they can sleep in the bed. Next one, please. It's not all plain sailing within the post-human home. So certainly there are lots and lots of stories of stealing things. It could be wrecking clothes, shoes in particular, or stealing food. And this woman here with her rescued Staffordshire Terrier, when I interviewed her, she made me stand next to her so she could actually show how the dog would literally shove her out of the way so he could open the fridge and choose what he wanted from it. And the story about the onion barges and samosas, it's the bit that they're frozen that makes me laugh every time, really. So there's lots of stealing food. But this also was seen as something that was amusing. Next slide, please. And you might say, well, these are just funny stories about stealing food. But I think underneath it, there is something about people living with dogs trying to understand that they're living with a different species that does have a different sensory perception. And so I've got quite a few quotes like this, but this was my favourite one, really. We shout at them, we wave our arms around, we sit and stare at them and freak them out because we behave like primates. And they don't behave like us at all. And then she says, we put food away and he can smell bloody anything. A door doesn't stop him smelling. He's so clever, he can open doors. He's more clever than my husband. He can close them too. So, but she's really reflecting. So she gets cross, but she knows it's not fair because she's living with a creature with different sensory perception. And perhaps that's part of the reason why these stories are amusing. Next one, please, Zoe. One of the most difficult chapters of the book is the one on food and eating, because one of the things I wanted to think about was whether people extended their relationships with dogs to other creatures too. And everybody claimed to like animals or to love animals. They talked about different kinds of animals that they liked in particular. There was lots of talk about intensive farming, breeding for the pet trade. This was all seen as a terrible thing and something that should change. There were lots of concerns about animals kept in cages, rabbits in particular. I didn't ask people about their eating practices or their dogs' eating practices. It's something that I got a lot of data on. People seem to want to tell me. So I knew that 7 people in the sample were vegetarians and 1 was a vegan. And I divided the others into restricted or unrestricted carnists. Some people would eat anything, their dogs would eat anything, others wouldn't. There were certain animals that would be eaten and certain animals that wouldn't. But actually, it was the vegetarians and the vegan that demonstrated the kind of highest level of boundary confusion when it came to animals. And I wondered whether this was about a kind of ambivalence over pet keeping, because there was a whole narrative about dogs wouldn't choose to be vegetarians, so I don't have a vegetarian dog. Next slide, please, Zoe. And this idea that meat is a kind of natural diet came over really strongly. So this is a advert. This is a logo for a pet food that's very popular at vets. It's seen as a healthy, high-end food. And if you look at the website of the person who developed the logo, the company, Canagan, told him explicitly that the dog on the dog food had to look like a wolf, because their whole narrative was that this is a natural food. This is the food of dogs' ancestors, because dogs are like wolves. And people made that clear association, which of course is deeply problematic, that dogs are essentially wolves. But even the one vegan in the study wasn't sure about a vegetarian dog. And actually, the vegetarians and the vegans had tried non-meat diet, but were still kind of pushed back to this idea that it was natural for dogs to eat meat. And I thought that would have changed significantly over the years in which I've been collecting data about dogs and dog food advertising, but it hasn't changed as much as I would have thought. Next one, please, Zoe. But I do think there are questions raised with living and being close to a creature that's not human. So for this woman here, she pushes it out of her mind, but then she draws the analogy between pigs and dogs, saying pork is one of her favourite meat. It troubles her. They're supposed to be as intelligent as dogs and have similar emotions. And this picture is a painting by the wonderful Hartmut Kuert from Germany, who in lots of his work, he places farmed animals in situations where you would find companion animals, or he places them both together to kind of trouble our ideas about where it is appropriate for animals to be. Next one, please, Zoe. Oh my goodness, I'm running out of time and voice. So I also, one thing that came across strongly in the research was the idea that people care for dogs. So people were saying dogs were very different than cats. And one of the reasons why is that walking dogs took a long time. So everybody in my sample was a so-called responsible dog owner. They walked their dogs on a daily basis. But I also started thinking about feminist ideas about care work, because a lot of the kind of services that humans provide dogs are similar to the kind of care work that we undertake for other humans, whether that's organising daycare or whether that's attending to healthcare needs. And certainly with people with very young dogs, ill and ageing dogs, there was a high burden of care, lots of stories of lack of sleep, disruptive sleep, that you're actually nursing animals at some points in their lives, as well as clearing up after them. Next one, please. But I also don't think it's a one-way street. So there is some literature on the emotional support that dogs provide that's kind of summed up by this person. They respond to how you feel, they feel your emotions, they want to be tactile and touch you, they want to be close to you if they think you're upset. But perhaps one of the most worrying bits of care work that dogs do on a daily basis is to simply be in the house. Because as Gary Larson suggests here, it's very rare, if not impossible, for the dog to decide to take itself off with a friend while the human stays in the house. And people kept saying a house would be empty. A home is not a home without a dog. And I thought, what does that imply? That the dog is there waiting to greet, and that is a task of care that is a product of our domination of other animals. Next one, please. Whether they nurse us or not, I'm not sure, but I know that when I probably go for a nap at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, our time, I will have a dog on the bed with me that I would like to think is worried about how I'm feeling. But certainly I think there's caring labour for humans, cleaning, tidying, shopping, cooking, entertaining, and there's caring labour of dog owners that's really similar. Perhaps the different one is providing exercise, but I think the cleaning and grooming is a kind of parallel, really, and certainly emotional labour of providing attention. But I think dogs do the same thing. And when I've said here they provide exercise, I don't think it's just that humans exercise dogs. Lots of people said, you know, having the dog gets you out, and the dog wanting to be out, even if the weather's bad, as it often is here in the UK, was an important aspect of their life with a dog. Next one, please, Zoe. I'm trying to hurry up now. In lots of the literature coming out of North America, family analogies are used. There are books about pets as family with that kind of title, academic papers produced, and I really did not find that. In fact, I found the opposite, that people were quite antagonistic to the idea that a dog stood in for a child or another kind of relationship. So this young woman at the top, you know, her friends and family are thinking it's time for her to be having a child. And she hasn't had children yet, but that Rocky is her little baby. I think it's almost just for them to reinforce their family values, which I thought was a really interesting comment. And certainly this was something that really bothered her. And people were very clear that a dog was a dog and they had particular relationships with a different species. But certainly there was lots of closeness and close relations with individuals. And if you took this quote out of context, you could think that this woman is talking about a human lover, thinking about him during the day when he's not here, something that's made you smile, he just makes you laugh. You know, there were lots of stories like that indicating that kind of emotional closeness. And one of the things I could not talk about was when people might lose a dog. Because in the first interview, people started welling up. I thought, no, there's a different project that I need to be doing in order to talk about dog loss. Next one, please. So here we have some antagonistic phrases. A dog's not like a baby. You've got a relationship with something that's not human. People often use that or it. And I didn't read too much into it because I was there listening to them. So I didn't see them as objectifying dogs because most of them had very close relationships with dogs. But this idea that there's something magical. And when I was rereading Plumwood last week, I was just like, yes, the magic is there. And the magic is there in our relationships with other creatures. And certainly it came through. So the bond of need, dependency, responsibility, love, crossing that boundary, the species boundary, is very exciting. And this guy finishes off saying, it's more exciting than it is with another human because it's much more mysterious. And he turns to his dog in the interview and says, isn't it, darling? It's mysterious. But this woman, I could actually write a paper just on this woman having a really hard time. She talks for about 12 minutes about species. It's so hard to get your head around it that she's a dog, I'm a human. I look at her with real love and think, you know me, I know you, and you're that thing, you're another species. So it's really like, she was like, at the end of it, she was like, wow. And I think that is an element, that mystery, that difference is why people don't think of dogs as children or fulfilling that particular relationship, why it is quite a special relationship. Next one, please. I am nearly there. So I said I've used Donna Haraway quite a bit and argued with her, even over email across my career. But I'm kind of drawn to her idea about creatures being oddkin. And this is where I kind of think I depart from both Haraway and Val Plumwood, actually. So sociologist Nikki Charles says practicing kinship daily in the household means that dogs could be kin because they're part of the same social group, and I do buy that. And I'm kind of like Haraway is more recently interested in Indigenous conceptions of if we call it kin, but there are other words for this, which are broader than family, that are about humans and non-humans. So I think this is where we need to go. We need to move away from the concept of family, which is so human, so heteronormative, so gendered, so problematic in many ways. But there's Donna Haraway, who wants us to make kin with compost. And when I read Plumwood, there's so many interconnected kin affiliations with a variety of different species. But in the study of dogs, I really did find that you could say dogs could be considered kin, and certainly cats and other creatures, but not all. Next one, please. So this guy is talking about Indian stick insects. So young boys tend to like to keep them in tanks at home. And they're a bit beyond him, he says, in terms of a relationship, but maybe people feel like he does about his dog, about their goldfish. But he says it's more extreme. The connection's more extreme, more evident with mammals. And the person he's walking with, who he does so on a regular basis, says perhaps it's the interest of watching what animals like fish do, the way they move, the colours, the way they breed. It's a visual thing. And somebody who had fish both inside and outside their home just said they're part of the furniture. And that's exactly what Ifu Tuan said in thinking about the keeping of goldfish. That these are objects of beauty, they're objects of interest, but they're not creatures with whom we have a relationship. So I think definitely there are perhaps limits to the idea of kin, or kin in an intimate sense, that can be applied. Maybe we just need to make up some other stuff, some other concepts, some other words to capture this. Next one, please. Finally, Foucault, he's somebody I've picked up and thrown down many times across my career. And this is a kind of little essay of other spaces where he introduces this idea of heterotopia and doesn't develop it very fully, in my view. But what he says is, even in situations that are quite dire, and he's talking about prisons, he's talking about hospitals, but even in, I would say, an anthroparchal social world, other stuff is going on. There are elements in which other species are exercising their agency within the mudded living in the post-human home. There's constantly compromise, there's boundaries being redrawn, there's relationships developing and changing. So perhaps the space of home is a space of possibility for some dogs, not for all, certainly not for all, and for humans too, because of that interspecies intimacy. In something I wrote a while ago with a former colleague, Tracy Jensen, we talked about the mongrel domestic, and that's how I kind of finish the book, really. Perhaps what we can learn in living with dogs is about their joy in the moment, and perhaps we need to try and be a little less human and think about being a little more dog, while enabling them to be as dog as they can, really. So I like this quote from Mead at the bottom: heterotopia is where things are different. And the idea that you can have difference that is not domination is important in Val's work, and it's always been important in mine. And I think we're on the final slide. So one of the things that people have said about my work is that I don't say what should happen. And that's because I'm quite wary about, I think it's difficult to say what should happen. And I think saying what should happen can be quite problematic. And in something that I wrote with a man I call my academic husband, my friend and former colleague, Stephen Hobden, we were quite drawn to Sebastian Freyenhagen's interpretation of Theodor Adorno. And Adorno talks about the need to live less wrongly. Adorno says it's actually quite easy to see historically what we shouldn't be doing, what causes harm. And Adorno actually talks about harm to non-humans too. So perhaps thinking about what we should do less of is a way forward, rather than think of what we, this kind of utopic future that we might aim for. So what relationships exist that need breaking or remaking or making, really? So for me, certainly we need to change the way we eat. We need to think about a whole range of animals. Certainly it's not just about dogs. If something reverses the tide of industrial animal farming, apart from climate change, I'd be glad to see that happen, and I'd be glad to see that happen too. And certainly we need to think about what we know about other species, because I think in homes with dogs, people had a lot of animal capital, as Leslie Irvin would put it. They had a lot of knowledge about their relationships. They were quite self-critical often of their relationships, and they did try and understand what it meant to be a dog living in a human home, I think, at least to some extent. So certainly I would want to have some kind of social policy that reflected our interdependencies with other creatures. If dogs in the UK are in 34% of homes, that's very significant. But in thinking about what would Val Plumwood do, I think she would disagree with me, and she'd say less of the dogs, Erika. But I do think that dogs are in and other creatures are out, and trying to shift that or think about different kinds of relationships, different degrees of intimacy that is possible with the non-human life world very broadly, is an important trajectory for animal studies for the future. And I'm going to shut up now, at last.
Well, thank you so much, Erika. That was fascinating. We have various people giving you little clappy hands. So just in case you can't see that, I want everyone to have a chance to pose a question if they want to, or to make a comment about about Erika's work. Would anyone like to start? Come on, people. Zoe's written, "Do dogs tested on in labs feature in your thinking about the role of dogs in human lives?"
No. And one of the reasons I started researching dogs was because I didn't want to do anything more on farmed animals, because I just couldn't bear it, really. And I've bumped into things constantly that I can't bear. So I did something on dogs in war, which made me cry. I was ending up in the military blogosphere, and I was in floods of tears every time I engaged with that. So it's a kind of, the labs thing has been a bit of kind of self-protection, but actually I'm kind of always drawn to the dark side. There's some nice things that I presented to you this morning, but the stuff that I'm doing at the moment, some of it's supposedly nice on service dogs, but is really kind of troubling me and worrying me. And then other stuff that I'm interested in is companion animals and domestic violence, which we're certainly behind you in Australia in terms of researching this subject. But last week was the first set of meetings in the UK Parliament about animal abuse and domestic abuse. So that was quite a kind of significant thing. And that, of course, is going to upset me.
Yeah.
Upset me terribly.
We have another question. Thanks, Erika. Josephine's asked, "Thank you so much, Erika. I was wondering about the links I think you were making between living less badly because we live with certain animals versus ideas of liberation, this tension, if you could speak to it." living less badly and liberation?
You see, that's a kind of tricky question for me. And I suppose that's one of the draws of Val Plumwood, because my understanding of Plumwood is that she doesn't think there can be a separating out of species. And I do think that. It's why I'm quite troubled about the idea of liberation. I think it's a very, well, actually, it's a Christian idea. It's a very Western idea. It's very much based on the liberal idea of the human as an individual. And I do wonder about it ethically sometimes, actually. So I don't think we live kind of separate lives and we can be disentangled from other creatures. I do think there are incredible problems with living with animals as companions in our homes. It's something that I wrestle with every day. Living with dogs, particularly one dog that I live with, is very challenging at every level. A friend of mine once said, "I've never met a dog that resents human authority so much." And I'm like, no, that's true. And she can kind of, in some ways, do what she likes within the home. Outside the home, it's often quite a battle. So I think that tension is there. I don't think we can ever remove it. I think there are certain things we could stop doing. I think there's a whole question to be raised about whether some animals should be kept as companions at all. Certainly so-called exotics. Certainly, I've often wondered about rabbits, because they're a worrying creature to be kept in the home, because not everybody is like a friend of mine and has the rabbits all over the house doing what they like, and in the garden where they're safe and protected. And, that might be a good life for a rabbit, but I don't think many lead good lives as pets. I don't know, Josephine. I think that tension is always there. I think the best we can do is keep worrying, really, rather than, I would never say companion animals are necessarily something that needs to be abolished. I think there's a whole agenda that's not fully thought through with the idea of abolishing relations with other creatures. We can't abolish relations with other creatures. We've got mites in our eyebrows and bugs in our guts, and we're interdependent on them all the time. Sorry, that's not really an answer. That's just a worrying rather than a reply.
Well, to be fair, she said, "Could you speak to it?" And you did. You spoke to it. Ondine, you'd like to ask a question?
Hi, thanks so much, Erika. That was really fascinating. I'm doing my PhD at the moment, and just this week I'm writing up my results about animals as family and siblings, because I interviewed young Australians, and a number of them spoke about how they feel animals in their home, particularly dogs, were their family, but in particular as siblings. And I'm wondering if maybe it's because of their age. They were 18 to 25-year-olds, and many of them grew up with dogs, like they were born into a family where there was already like an older dog in some cases, and they kind of played with the dog together, kind of like as siblings, especially the ones who didn't have other human siblings their own age. So I'm wondering, when you talked about the kind of resistance of your interviewees about family, dogs as family, maybe that could have come from seeing dogs as children, and maybe the kind of social pressures around women and children. And maybe there's more opportunity for people to see animals as family if they're more like siblings.
Yes, because it doesn't have the power dynamics, I think. So there are some studies that have looked at younger children, and they're always including, like the hamster will be closer to them than the grandparents and things like that, which often troubles sociologists of the family particularly. But I think, yes, in terms of those relationships of equality, because it was definitely the kind of babying of animals or treating them as children and as permanent dependents and as permanent kids, really, rather than as adults of another species. That's what troubled my participants. But I'm increasingly thinking, so I started my research in London, and people said, well, you found weird stuff because Londoners are weird cosmopolitan sorts. So then I did a smaller study when I moved to the countryside. And even with people who came from farming families, I found very similar things. Dogs in the beds, not expecting that. So I didn't really find much of a difference. But I'm working with some people from the University of Guelph in Canada at the moment. And what's coming through our interview data really strongly is dogs as children. I'm like, oh, is the UK weird, or is Europe weird in this sense? I'm not sure. It's because this is something that I really want to kind of carry on looking at. So we should have a conversation. Your research sounds very interesting indeed.
Would love that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everyone. There's not another question, is there? We are just out of time before we have a short break and come back for the workshop. I'm thinking, what time is it now? 7:03. If we come back in 7 minutes, does that? And we have 50-minute session for the workshop.